Welcome back. It's time for us to actually start implementing sessions because we now have a profile to work with. And remember, our goal here is to try and do this. We're going to sign in to our app. The user is going to send username and password. The server is then going to generate a JWT token, and we're going to send that to the user so that next time they access any of the routes that are protected or require authentication, like Profile 23, they'll have to send this JWT token with them. So that when a user gets a profile or updates a profile by doing a post request, well, they have to send the JWT token to the server. The server then can verify the token using the .verify method, or in our case, it can actually have the token stored in a Redis database, check it to make sure that, it's a valid one. And then if everything checks out, all right, you can have your profile, or you can update your profile. And in this video, we're going to work on this part. We're going to generate the JWT token after the user signs in. Let's get started. Now, if we go back to our server.js, we have our Docker Compose running in the background here. Everything checks out. The endpoint that we want to work with is the sign-in endpoint. So when we sign in, we're calling this function handle sign in. And you see here that it's a little bit different than the other ones. You see that all of the other endpoints receive a request response, and then they have a function that receives the request response. And we also pass in the database and the bcrypt, that is the hashing library. Now, this is a little bit different because I wanted to show different ways of doing it. In this case, whenever sign in is called, well, the handle sign in will be called with the database and bcrypt using dependency injection. That is, we give the dependency of database and bcrypt into handle sign in, so that when handle sign in is called here in signin.js, it is called with the DB bcrypt. And then whenever there's a post request, the function gets run again. So once again, this is a higher order function, a function that returns a function, and it receives the request response. And it works both ways. You can do it this way, or you can do it this way. And this is just cleaner because, well, we run this function, and then whenever post gets hit, whenever a user signs in, we're going to add the request response automatically to this handler. Now, here's the thing. Right now, handle sign in, we want to make it better. We don't want to just say, use the sign in methods that we had before. We need to now generate a token. So let's change this to something else. Let's change it to, let's say, sign in authentication. Sounds a little bit more official. Okay, and this sign in authentication, we're going to have to create. So let's go to signin.js. And in signin.js, let's change now let's add the const sign in authentication. And this sign in authentication is going to do what handle sign in used to do. It's going to receive a database and a bcrypt through dependency injection. It's going to then receive the request response. And then it's going to do a little bit of things here. For now, though, let's make sure that we're exporting this new function instead of the handle sign in. And let's talk about what we're going to do inside of here. If we remember our diagram, well, we want to obviously check the passwords and everything, check the database, do what handle sign in is doing, but we also want to generate a JWT token if everything checks out. And the way I like to write things is to think about what the function does, write things out with functions that don't exist yet so we can just slowly build it out. Let's give it a go here. What we want to check first, in this case, is we want to make sure that, well, first of all, we're going to receive request response from the request from the client. So let's check if the authorization header is set by the client. Because remember, they can send JWT tokens in the authorization header. And don't worry, we're going to see how that's done on the client side. But we want to check, because if they already have this authorization token, they shouldn't be able to sign in again. They can just go ahead and just get into the website, grab their profile. I mean, that's one of the main reasons we're doing this, is we don't want the user to constantly have to sign in. And in here, let's just return two things, or have two options. One is, do we have the authorization in the headers, in the sign-in? If that's the case, well, then we can say something like grab the user profile. For now, let's just name it get auth token ID. And this is a function that doesn't exist. So I'm just going to leave it the way it is. And up here, just call it const get auth token ID. And this function is going to be a silly function that does absolutely nothing other than console log auth OK. Let's save that. Now, within here, we have the second option. The second option is if they don't have the authorization, well, we want to handle the sign-in. So once again, we're going to say handle sign-in. And remember that handle sign-in needs the database bcrypt request and response objects. So I'm going to give the request, or let's start off with db bcrypt request and response objects. And because this is no longer a higher order function, we're just calling it once. Let's just change this from a function that returns a function to just simply a good old regular function, just like that. Let's add this on a new line, actually, just so we can see it better. That's better. So we have, do we have authorization? In that case, grab the auth token ID and hopefully grab the user profile. Otherwise, we want to handle sign-in, which is what we have by default already. Now, in here with handle sign-in, I want to go over an important concept. And that is, we've just changed the handle sign-in from being the default handler of this endpoint to now having the sign-in authentication. And when we do that, mentally, just to simplify things and to avoid any future errors, I want to say that, okay, because this is the handler of the endpoint, this should be the thing that returns a response, a status 200, a JSON response. We don't want the handle sign-in to be returning the response.json or error response status 400 because, well, this is just a helper function now that we use inside of the main handler. If for some reason a new developer comes along and sees this and says, oh, I'll just return a response in here, well, it's going to error out because we can't send multiple responses. So I like keeping things clean, and whatever handles the actual endpoint should be the one that actually returns a response. Now, there's a nice way that we can clean things out. Let's go back to the handle sign-in function here and change all our responses to just return a promise. Because at the end of the day, handle sign-in is sort of handling promises. It's doing the database select, checking the database, which returns a promise. And whenever we have a function, we want to make sure that we stay consistent. That function should always return an expected output. And that's something that we've learned before in this course. That is, we don't want to send a promise or a string. We want to stick to something predictable so that if another function, like sign-in authentication, is using it, well, we make sure that the sign-in authentication, whoever is writing this, doesn't have to worry about the handle sign-in function. We can trust that it's working and it's only returning a promise. All right, let's change this so that now we have a response that comes from sign-in authentication and changing handle sign-in to make sure it doesn't do any responses and just returns promises. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is in the handle sign-in, we need to return something to the client, to the front end. So we need some sort of a response that we send back. So let's say within here, I'm going to add a .then for handle sign-in. And maybe I'll keep this on one line so it's easier to see. So the handle sign-in is going to have a .then. It's going to receive the user, as you can see here. We're going to be returning the user from here. And this user, or let's just leave it at data for now. This data is going to have, for now, let's just do a response.json and just return the data. That is the user that we're interested in. And for some reason, if that doesn't work out, well, then we can just do a .catch. And this .catch will receive the error response.status 400. And for now, we can just return the actual error. All right. Now, if I go back here now, we need to make sure that the handle sign-in returns a promise because, well, we're doing a .then, .catch. Going back here, we look at the handle sign-in function. And the first thing that I notice is the fact that if no email and password is given, well, we're going to return a status 400, which we don't want to do. Perhaps instead what we want to do is reject a promise so that it catches in the handle sign-in here. So I'm going to change this to, instead of response status, to a promise.reject, which automatically rejects and returns a promise. Nice and simple. If we keep going down here, the next step we see that, all right, we're doing this database lookup, but we're actually not returning anything here. I don't see a return keyword. We're returning inside of it, but not here. And this is a common mistake with promises. You always want to make sure that you're returning promises. So in our case, let's just add a return keyword in here. Now we're returning this promise. And as we go inside of it, we see that, okay, well, we don't want to have a response. We just want to return the user. And perhaps we might want to even change the name to handle sign-in to perhaps check username password or something along those lines. For now though, let's change this to a nice little one-liner, or let's grab it like this and return the user. And remember, it returns an array of the user, in our case, the one user that it returns from checking the password and email. That looks a little bit cleaner. And then for the .catch here, we want to make sure that instead of the status, again, we can just say a promise.reject. And once again here, for any errors, we'll just do promise.reject. All right, so no matter what, this function should be returning a promise now, so that with handle sign-in, we can just handle it like this. .then, send us the data, that is the user. Otherwise, we'll catch any errors that we've received, in our case, unable to get user, wrong credentials, and just return that JSON response. Now, let's save here and test out our code. We've written a bit of code without actually testing it. So let's just go back here and sign out and test with our good old friend a.com or a@a.com. And open up the console, make sure there's no errors here as I click sign in. All right, look at that, no errors, and we're still able to sign in. We've accomplished absolutely nothing in terms of functionality on the front end, but we now have more flexibility. We're still returning the user as they sign in, the user from the database. But we've also extended it, so now that we check for authorization headers. And if that exists, we can just grab the auth token ID. Now that we have that set up, in the next video, I want to actually generate a JWT token for this user. If it's their first time logging in, they don't have an authorization token, well, I want to handle sign in, by grabbing the user, but also when I return the user data, I also want to return a JWT token so that in future visits, they don't have to go through this step again. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.